Max, local bush regenerator, grew up at Durrabee and been doing bush regen for about 10 years. And within the last 5 years is where more focusing in towards the open forest habitat, working with national parks on some Save Our Species projects within open forest, and working in partnership with cultural fire practitioners like Jug Alliance and other local, thank you Sarah, cultural fire practitioners in our area, and learning how fire is used to manage open forests and sclerophyll forests. My presentation is going to be talking about koala habitat and how we can protect our koala habitat, guides and methods to restore koala habitat, and also to create new koala habitat. Koalas live in sclerophyll forests, many different types of sclerophyll forests, which I'll go through a bit later. But within the canopy, they often need at least 30% of the canopy trees to be koala feed trees. Generally in a sclerophyll forest, it's pretty bland and vanilla what's in the canopy for a diversity-wise, compared to our rainforest, it's high biodiversity in the canopy. So generally in a sclerophyll forest, you get around 2 to 4 canopy species. They don't have to be all eucalypts. They can be a mix of non-eucalypt species, trees and shrubs. So for example, eucalypts, corymbias, lophostomans, angophores, casuarinas, wattles, and so on. But koalas also occupy the adjacent vegetation communities to sclerophyll forest, which could be the rainforest or swamp forest for shelter and so on, or moving A to B. So forest structure for sclerophyll forests, it is a bit blurry, so it doesn't kind of get a gist. Our region's got so many different sclerophyll forests and different forest structure. It's really important understanding our forest structure because that will help our restoration goal for a bit later. On the left here, we've got a grassy open tallowood red gum grassy forest. These grassy forests can either be wet or dry sclerophyll, and you tend to find them the red gum and tallowood more on the basalt soils on northern slopes, western slopes, and you often find them around the Dunoon to Modenville to Tullara. You find them on top of Canorigan, and even Rose Road, you even find a few. Don't exactly know every single patch around, but they're dotted around. A familiar vegetation community we're probably all familiar with around here is, back to the grassy forest. So in these forests is widely spaced canopy trees. They allow higher lights onto the forest floor. It's really open. In the mid-story, it's quite open as well, from consisting of casuarinas, forest oak, to wattles. Some local species around here like Devesia arborea, bat's-wing coral tree also occupy those mid-stratum, but it's quite open, and where the diversity of those grassy open forests is within that ground layer. So Andy Baker would say for a grassy forest, 80% of the diversity lives less than 2 metres tall, down in there. We've got our open ferny forests. Again, still an open canopy where we're getting brush box, flooded gum, sometimes pink bloodwood, tallow-woods and so on that I've noticed around here. These forests can be an open mid-story or closed, depending on time since fire, which I'll talk about a bit later. But in these mid-stories, same as like the forest oaks and the wattles in the mid-story, but it's got a dense ferny ground layer, but also other shrubs occupying it like hovias, hakeas, phyllanthus and so on that occupy them. And the ferns that you often see like either bracken fern, blechnums and dudias. And then we've got our other wet sclerophyll forest, which is a very tall, like 50 to 70 metres tall eucalypts of brush box and flooded gum, sometimes pink bloodwood and tallowood, with quite a dense mid-stratum and ground layer of rainforest species, consisting of rainforest pioneers to vines. And also the species that occupy in these areas have also got a fire relationship too, because they live in fire country. So some species like the scentless rosewood's got a lignituber, can resprout after fire, and you also see blueberry ash as well that have a fire relationship, or resprout, and bolwarra resprout after fire. So I'll talk about the story about fire about these shortly, but yeah, feel free to jump in at any time if you want to ask any questions. We can just read that, yeah. So yeah, koalas live in fire-prone environments. Towards those ecosystems before, they've got different fire intervals. But yeah, these ecosystems need fire in order to be maintained and to maintain that forest health, because as we can see, a lot of the forests that haven't received disturbance or fire, we're not actually seeing much succession of younger eucalypt saplings coming up, nor casuarinas and so on. We're not seeing them as well, and we're losing our ground layer diversity, whether it's our ferny forest or our grassy forests. And as long time since fire occurs, that mid-stratum, whether it's wattle, whether it's rainforest, starts to become quite dominant and thick and can shade out that understory, and we're not going to get that recruitment of those eucalypts. So when we're looking at these ecosystems here, I can't tell you exactly what the fire frequency intervals for each one. I would really recommend looking into the New South Wales Burn Guidelines or speaking to Juggled Alliance cultural fire practitioners about intervals and so on. But in order for these grassy forests to the left, they need to be managed with fire quite regularly in order to maintain that grassy habitat. If fire's taken off, you'll start to get rainforest pioneers tiptoeing up the hill and start occupying that space, and they can get a bit dominant in the mid-story, and as they start creating shade, you start to lose that 80% of that diversity that lives in the ground layer. Same story with the wet sclerophyll forest. They can tolerate a bit more shade and a longer fire interval. And for this one to the right here with the tall fluttergum and tallow wood with the dense rainforest understory, is these forests do need fire, but probably like a bushfire once every 200 years or so, in order for those eucalypt saplings to germinate and to become to that size again. If it doesn't receive those fire, that will eventually become rainforest, and those eucalypts will get outcompeted. Weeds is always the issue for anything. Us with our high rainfall and high fertile soils and our huge weed diversity, doesn't make bush regen a fun task. So I'll talk about weeds shortly, but yeah, as I was mentioning, is with the removal of fire in our koala habitats, we're getting that transition of that mid-story from establishing. So when that happens, we're losing our ground layer species, so we're losing all of our flora, and as we start to lose all of our flora, we start to lose our fauna. So a lot of species like the black-striped wallaby, red-necked paddymmelon, and bandicoots and forest owls and so on, they're really reliant on that open habitat. As they start to disappear, they get moved on to somewhere else. But as well, our sclerophyll species that occupy these ecosystems have got terrible seed dispersal mechanisms, and also terrible seed dormancy periods. So compared to like our bleeding heart, it can live in the soil for about 500 years plus, waiting and waiting and waiting till a tree falls, it pops up, does its thing. A lot of our sclerophyll species might only sit in the soil for about 10 to 20 years. And even some species don't even have a seed dormancy at all, like the casuarina holds on, and the eucalypts hold onto their seed, waiting and waiting and waiting till it's the right time to drop their seed. If they get shaded out, so does that species, and that species gets wiped out. And these ecosystems are incredibly fragile because they've got terrible seed dispersal mechanisms, so they're not reliant on birds to move their fruit all around. Like a bleeding heart bird can fly it from there, fly it over to the next valley. These ecosystems are reliant on ants and insects to move their material around, or sometimes by wind or by just gravity. Eucalypts have just dropped their seed, so they don't move far. So eucalypts might only be the limit of where they drop. Some other little small ground species might only move a metre that year. So once you've lost them, they're very hard to bring back. Also, with these forests, a lot of the ground layer species that occupy them, they've got very soft growing tips and growing buds compared to their rainforest species. So dense mulch, they just push through and they see each other's trees and they push them through wanting to get that bit of light. These sclerophyll species got such soft growing buds, they just don't push through dense leaf litter. They need that fire in order to stimulate growth. So the built up biomass as well, as we also know, increases bushfire risk potentially. but also inhibits a lot of our species from growing and so on. I'll talk about bell miner-associated dieback a bit later, but does everyone here a little bit familiar on that issue? These are the principles at managing koala habitats as a restoration guide. I'll go through each one shortly a bit later, but first of all is protect. So we want to, and then restore, expand, and revegetate. But before we do that, we also want to understand our reference community, because our reference community is going to be our guide for restoration goals. I see a lot in this dire state for our koalas when going, quick, what's their favourite koala feed trees? Let's just plant them all around, which is beneficial towards the koalas, but we can also use this money as an ecosystem function and benefit all the other species that occupy that space as well. And it's important to know, like I was saying earlier, like generally in a sclerophyll forest, it's like two to four canopy species. So it's finding those reference communities that's, say, neighbouring your property and following that guide. Like I see a lot where swamp mahogany, our koala's favourite tree, grows in the swamp sclerophyll towards the coast. It's being planted all along the ridge tops and so on around here, trying to help koalas. So yeah, it's important to doing that ecosystem approach. There's a whole world of the relationships of the nutrient water cycling that I'll just never fully understand. But like, for example, like the family Fabaceae, wattles and peas are nitrogen fixing, so that could be beneficial to eucalypts and so on in the process of managing it as well. And also whether it's a grassy forest to a ferny forest to a heathy forest will be a guide on how we do our tree plantings with spacings and so on. So yeah, I'll go through that shortly. So yeah, first of all, obviously we don't want to be clearing our existing koala habitat, and where we've got our existing koala habitat is so few and far between in good condition. They are slipping away, so we're wanting to ensure to protect them, and we're wanting to ensure that there no weed incursions is going to occur on them, but most importantly is we need to consider consulting to a fire consultant, Juggling Alliance, or a fire ecologist, getting a burn plan, because these ecosystems will start to change into a different vegetation community if they aren't being managed through fire. So it's important that these ecosystems are managed properly. So secondly, we're wanting to restore, so where our existing koala habitat and a few lantana or pasture weeds is starting to tiptoe in, we're wanting to make sure they're looked after. And as well, in those areas is still where we've got our biodiversity. So once you take out the lantana and so on, you're going to get that nice biodiversity come back, and we're not wanting to lose them. And like I was saying just before, once you've lost all the diversity that lives in that sclerophyll forest and you take out the lantana, you're going to get pretty poor results of getting them coming back. So it's important to be protecting and restoring, and that's like the two priority for koala habitat. I like to see weeds as there's transformer weeds, and what transformer weeds is where a weed is turning one vegetation community into another. So the sclerophyll forest with that open canopy, whether it's grassy, ferny or a rainforest understory, once these camphor laurels and lantanas come in, tiptoe in, and they start to establish, we all know how densely crowned a camphor laurel is, and what we see underneath it is pretty bare, not much stuff at all. When that happens, it's completely changed that sclerophyll community into a weedy rainforest community. And once camphor laurels established, it is incredibly of a challenging task to try and bring it back to sclerophyll forest. It's a huge threat to our sclerophyll forest, those rainforest weeds. But we also we've got our pasture weeds, that paspalum, molasses and Ceteria. So where we still got existing open forest with a healthy ground layer, and once those pasture weeds start tiptoeing in, they can quickly, easily smother our ground layer and so on. And for example, in cattle country where cows are constantly feeding on the pasture grasses and so on, and where you still got some native ground layer still dotted around, if you take cattle off it straight away, those Ceteria and the Rhodes grass will grow to its full tall height, and a lot of our sclerophyll species that are just surviving in cattle farms quickly get outcompeted very quickly. So it's very conscious on how threatening those weeds are, especially when you're going to consider excluding cattle from some of your koala habitat, is maybe consider looking at what you've got this ground layer, what weeds you got there, and it's not going to quickly get slip away and get taken out. So big advocate for taking cattle off, but also being aware that you could also lose that ground layer very quickly if you've got some of those weeds on your property. Yeah, where are we up to now? So this is a property out at Rock Valley, a common site we've all seen, lantana all underneath eucalypts and so on. About 50 metres up the hill was our reference community that's still in good condition. Grassy red gum bloodwood forest oak forest. About up the hill, nice and grassy towards where we are, the ground layer was gone. So, and as you can start to see, also talking about weeds, I like to categorise it whether it's a rainforest weed or a pasture weed. And a rainforest weed like lantana, camphor, laurel, tobacco will also be feeding on our rainforest species. So generally where you start to see lantana establishing, you will get that succession of rainforest species coming into the area too. So like this patch here, we've got a lot of ribbon woods and celery woods popping in too. So like our grassy forest now overtaken by lantana is now shifting into towards a more of a wet sclerophyll forest with a rainforest understory. So it's important to know what our reference community is and our reference guide for that forest. So we took out the lantana on this forest, and then we also stem injected the celery woods and ribbon woods in that section there. This is a common site we see on a tackling lantana. This is a no spray property, so it was a bit annoying having to do it all by hand, but now we're left with that thick biomass, and a year on, not much came up. It was pretty poor, but what did come up with is explosions of bleeding hearts, macarengas, and sallywattles, and celery woods, classic rainforest pioneers. And for a rainforest regen, it's a great site, and that's the great succession of transitioning it into a rainforest. But that wasn't our goal for this property. So those were either plucked out. We did do a burn on this property. It was very patchy, and it was very patchy, and now we're starting to get the results. They're all little baby poas starting to pop up, and other little fun things coming up. So it's still a slow process. So camphors reshoot from fire, and I particularly had it as a bush regenerator having to retreat a burnt camphor laurel. So if you are considering about regenerating a site and you're going, yep, I'm at that stage, I'm ready to do fire, I would heavily suggest treating your camphor laurels first, because once they're nice and easy to drill, but once they've been burnt, they just pop up in the thousands, and yeah, it takes a few years to get on top of it. With fire, you're needing the ground layer and you needed the grasses or ferns in order to carry fuel. So generally where a camphor laurel is established, you've lost that ground layer, so it's not that flammable in the winter burn season. I've done projects like this one. We started on the dense lantana pit when up the top was just glorious in habitat with lantana just poking in. I wish we started on that project because we spent a few years on this one, and then I've now watched up there start to degrade. So you've got to pick your battles, and these ecosystems can completely collapse very quickly once that mid-story starts to tiptoe in, whether it's lantana or mesic species tiptoeing in. So yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about giant devil's fig.
Ooh.
When we had the landslides back 2 years ago, that whole area that was bare, mud and rock, immediately became infested with giant devil's fig, 5, 6 metres. And just wondering what happens next.
We're getting 10 years ago we didn't have devil's fig, and now it's our major weed. And yeah, so the landslips, and then before the bushfires, where the bushfires went along nightcap, saw explosions of devil's figs outbreaks. We're just going to have these new weed incursions and threats that are just going to be a big headache and so on to deal with. And plus on those slips, they're not fun to work on too, and they're still moving.
My son cut down most of them and poisoned them.
Yep.
And then that was replaced by a really tall tobacco bush.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not a bad thing, is that right?
They grow in conjunction.
I guess it's just referring to your vegetation community, but then also, I guess, landslips and so on. It's just yeah, I think if you're ever wanting to work sclerophyll habitat, start from your best area. On a landslip, that's getting really degraded very quickly. So, so working in a sclerophyll habitat, these ecosystems, I would suggest working on your good areas, and some sections that was probably sclerophyll habitat and is shifting towards the devil's figs and so on, and you're losing that ground layer, and it's just going to be a monster job to try and turn it into this.
You're probably surrounded by wet sclerophyll.
Yeah.
And then it actually slipped.
Yeah, like because we in bush regen, we use shade quite a bit in order to eliminate weeds. That's our best friend. And that's been an awesome job to getting rid of tobacco, devil's figs, and a lot of our nastier weeds. It's just, and so whether those landslip spots, that's where you might just rely on a shade out weed approach and turn it into a more of a rainforesty spot there. Or if you're prepared to spend this energy to turn it back into that nice wet sclerophyll ferny spot, or you might get, once you start getting that shade, you might start getting your blacknums and Dudia ferns start tiptoeing down. So I guess it's site specific where you are too. But yeah, devil's figs isn't fun. And yeah, and it's usually on the little partsy corners of your property that you just don't visit to. You might only visit to every 6 months, and then you see that big healthy stand, happy as Larry. Expand and revegetate. So before, like we've identified our existing koala healthy habitat, and where we're going, yep, we can do assisted regen where lantanas underneath those red gums there, and we're wanting to expand it. But then we see, oh, there's a massive paddock in between to another patch of koala habitat over there. That's where we will need to consider into tree planting. But yeah, again, with tree planting, it's important to go by the reference community, which can be challenging because our land, all around here has just been so butchered, so it's hard to gauge what reference community we got. So soil type, topography has a big play to it, and the rainfall and so on. So yeah, I can't tell you exactly where everything is, but just go for a bit of a drive to find what aspect you're on. Or it could be a neighbour's property up there with the nice taller woods, flooded gums, and you might carry on that story along to there. So important to find your reference community because that's going to be your guide on restoration goals. Tree selection and spacing, obviously using your reference community species. And when we are, like in the New South Wales Koala Management Plan, they actually recommend 8 to 10 metres spacings. I would heavily suggest around, 5 to 15 metres is probably what I would suggest. And why is that? Because as we're wanting our trees to become nice and big, sprawly trees, so with many perches for our koalas to sit in as well, but also serve that open habitat towards our ground layer too. And as you've seen in a lot of woodlots, eucalypts have got this feature called crown shyness, which actually is where there's light, they won't put a branch. So where you see in woodlots, you'll see they're planted at 4 metre spacings, and you'll see these black butts, tall power poles, tall and straight after 30 years old, tall and straight. And are they serving koala habitat? I don't know, but there's obviously not much perch and habitat for them as well. So having it wider, you get those nice sprawly spaced eucalypts as well. In these close spacing eucalypts, we're also going to start getting more habitat for some of the rainforest birds to start bringing camphor laurel and privet and so on. So the widely spaced reduces the frugivore habitats for the grassy forest and the ferny forest areas and so on. But as well, with these plantings, I'm seeing a lot of 50-50 of eucalypt and rainforest plantings, and we're going, cool, our reference community that we've got is that nice wet sclerophyll patch with that nice rainforest understory underneath the flooded gum and tallow woods. If you go to those reference communities, you'll see that those canopy eucalypts are much greater age than the ground layer rainforest species down below. So when we're going in planting the rainforest mixed in with eucalypts, it's not going to take long for those rainforest species to quickly topple over the eucalypts. You often see in the sclerophyll forest where you've got towering big flooded gums, towering big brush boxes and tallow woods, and the rainforests are in that sort of mid-stratum. So we also got to consider when we start doing that 50-50 planting approach, Are we creating koala habitat, or is that koala habitat? It might be koala habitat for the first 20 years because the eucalypts are quick off the mark. But what happens after that is the blue quandongs, native temerants, going to start towering over the top of them. So there's some considerations to have. So in the New South Wales koala management plan, they actually suggested do spacings like that. And then if you're wanting to regenerate that sort of rainforest mesic understory through your planting, just allow for natural regeneration of those rainforest species to come in, so those eucalypts get that age enough that they can beat a lot of those species as well. Narrow tree plantings serve a lot of purpose too, as we've seen. You can see on the top of the ridge there, macadamia farms and the tallow woods planted along the road there. So they do serve habitat, but if we're wanting to look after the whole ecosystem, I would probably suggest that the wider spacings and so on. Anything else if someone's asked?
Would you, with that site there, would you be likely to keep that slashed or grazed, or would you start burning parts of it? What would be the ideal to work with that line of trees?
You don't necessarily have to, that's just a paddock. I've had a look. Not much ground layer at all. So you can just let that paddock grow up and you just spray around the trees. Trying to reinstate that understory, especially when you've got against paddock weeds, is a big journey. So I would actually probably wait till those trees get to a mature size, maybe 5 to 10 years. And that's when you start getting that partial shade, that's when I would probably start considering it reinstating that ground layer.
So if that wasn't slashed or didn't have cattle in that pasture, wouldn't we just end up with a lot of weeds coming in? You would, so,
and that's the issue that I'm seeing. Well, not the issue, but in rainforest plantings, we plant at a 1.8 metre spacing to shade out weeds. We've applied this 1.8 method for the eucalypts, which we shade out weeds. That's a win, tick box, but does that create that sclerophyll forest in the future? Or are these sclerophyll forests going to become sort of lollipops and easily be toppled over by that mixed rainforest species or so on, or I've seen plantings of just eucalypts at 2 metre spacings. Is that going to be serving koala habitat? I'm not too sure. So, what was your question? I'm sort of
it's just if that amount of pasture or that amount of paddock wasn't managed with slashing or...
And that's the issue, because we're thinking our restoration goal is to eliminate weeds. Some cases for these, like rainforests, you definitely want to get on top of those weeds because those weeds could be threatening to those trees. But for these ecosystems, you just might go, well, that paddock grass is just going to be there for the next probably 10 years till you're at that stage to get rid of it. Those trees are big enough, starting to create a bit of shade, starting to reduce the growth of those species down there. But as well, once those trees get to that age, they start fruiting as well. And so when it gets to that pasture, that's when you can go to the stage where you could consider burning. And burning is a really handy tool because a lot of these pasture grasses got a long seed dormancy in the soil. So each time you spray it, they'll just keep popping up, keep popping up, keep popping up. But fire's a really handy tool. Once you burn it, it will flush everything to the surface. And if you do timely weed control methods, you can flush seed bank early. And if you're waiting that 10 years period till the eucalypts are big enough and they're dropping the seeds down, you'll get that germination of those eucalypts. But in ash bed, which I'll go through a bit later, is the best approach to cast seeding, and that's when you can get all your nice sclerophyll species that you want, and you can cast seed it into those ash beds areas. But again, trying to regenerate this is a challenging task, and where we've still got our existing koala habitat that's still got that ground layer. That is a huge priority, because then it's another journey to try and collect the seed, to getting what seed to get, and so on, and to try and cast seed it. So. Yeah, and you can, I'll go through understory planting shortly.
Would it be better to leave the trees space and have good grazing management for the castor site every place all the time, and focus on restoring what probably looks like cattle over the forest behind?
Yeah, so that's a nice little rainforest gully down there, a sort of nice little spot. So yeah, you could, when the trees are up to that sort of plus 3 years old and they're quite big enough, and you could probably let the cows in to manage that area, but also keeping in mind cows can be a bit cheeky to our koalas as well. And a lot of our koala habitat is in cattle country, You drive here to Canorigan, Bentley, all the way to Kyogle. It's just all koala habitat, and that's where our koalas are. So they do serve a purpose, the livestock, and maybe to reducing the weeds. It's not the best picture, and you've got your maybe end goal, or you might do reduced stocking. But yeah, no, they've gone to talk about cows. But yeah, you just got to be sort of prepared that doing this planting method is you're not going to win on the weeds. You're going to get the trees up. They're going to still serve koala habitat. They're going to still be nice and sprawly, and that's a win. And then when you're at the ready of the stage to reinstating that understory, a lot of projects have seen where it's now been 10 years plus of that sort of high stem density of eucalypts being planted and mixed rainforest species. The eucalypts are just tall and skinny and so on. Sure, you've beaten the weeds, but they're not serving koala habitat too. So yeah, any questions? No? Like I was saying, something about the smoke and the ash and so on really stimulates a lot of our sclerophyll species and eucalypt saplings, and I've had really good results post-fire in throwing the seed down. I've also had results on where I haven't done a burn and so on. So for that Lantana site, I just thought we weren't going to be burning, so we raked areas away to the bare soil, saw if we had any germination from that disturbance and so on. We had a bit, but that's where we threw down seed. And so when we do throw down seed, it's also a battle because our ants absolutely love that seed that you're throwing down too. So you rake it away with the rako there and then stomping it down. You're wanting to do it when you can grab the soil and turn it into a nice bolus, into a nice ball, nice and moist and soft. A lot of our sclerophyll species are winter growing species, or they have that germination period in that winter period. So, and yeah, when you are making a bit of a seed cocktail, I might grab some of the local eucalypts in the area, I might grab some of the shrubs and the grasses and so on, and make a bit of a seed cocktail and throw it down. So it's sometimes a bit hit and miss. It's all about timing on the seasons and so on. But yeah, generally, if you're wanting to regen grassy forest, generally where you're starting to see your native grasses seeding themselves and start dropping, that's actually a good time to start cast seeding. So just watching what your site's doing will help guide. And then yeah, if you're too impatient like me on waiting 10 years for your planting to get up, and you're just like, well, I'm going to bite the bullet and I'm just going to do planting of the understory. As you know, planting tube stock, $2.50 for a tube stock, and we're wanting, say for a grassy forest, we're wanting the whole ground layer to be it. So planting them at metre spacings is going to be pretty expensive pretty quickly. So I probably would suggest just doing clumps of 3 to say 15 and a clump there. Do them close together. And we're going to still use our rainforest guide to shading out weeds, but we're not shading out weeds there. We're shading weeds at knee height. So we're wanting to outcompete the weeds, lock up the bare soil, lock it up. And then once they're all locked up, then they're seeding onto the sites. So when you're at that stage of ready to burning, and you do burn the pasture weeds and some of your native grasses, you've got already seed there to reproduce and so on. But yeah, it's all up to your really capacity and so on. But be a bit strategic where you do cast seed. If you've got a really weedy spot, just maybe don't consider that. Get some of the less weedier spots, and that's maybe where you will consider cast seeding, because once you make that disturbance, everything's going to come up and go whooshka, and it's a challenging job trying to distinguish what your native species are, and then also having to deal with those weeds. And a lot of another thing, like our pasture weeds, a lot of them come from Africa, also live in fire country as well, so terry, molasses, Rhodes grass. So they have quite a positive relationship to fire. So once you do burn it, they're going to go into a big seeding fit as well. So making sure you get them before they get to that stage. I wouldn't think of it going like, yep, we've got this 50 by 50 area. I'll just consider, yep, we've got this 10 by 10 area. Sure, slash your paddock and so on. But you just might work on that sort of 10 by 10 metre patch, also seeing what capacity you've got at doing the weeding and so on. Trying to ID grasses is an absolute migraine. And especially trying to key out grasses at that size. So you just do your little patch first, you burn it, you're going to get a huge amount of weed seed bank come to the surface. If you're using chemical, then you're probably going to have to keep spraying that site till you've bled the site from the weed seed bank, and that's when you consider about doing your cast seeding and so on. I've seen projects where you've burnt and you cast seeded and you see all your little native species popping up, but then you see all the Soteria next to it. And then you're like, got a spray pack and you're like, oh. You're a bit overwhelmed. I get overwhelmed quick. When we are looking at these sclerophyll environments, generally with rainforest, we're sort of wanting to come to a site every 2 to 4 months for the first couple of years, and that's probably going towards sort of that 4-6 month after that when we start to get that canopy and so on. And during these sclerophyll forests, we've got these rainforest weeds are established, and you might get on top of those rainforest weeds early in the first couple of years. Lantana, camphor laurel, they're out of the way, but then the site's going to start transitioning to more of pasture weeds and more of this open-ish forest, so you're going to get different weed incursions. So yeah, your monthly intervals on maintenance will probably differ. Obviously, if you can visit the site monthly, that's ideal, but as a bush regenerator, we don't have that luxury too much. So, and another thing is revegetating these forests is where also you're wanting to pick restoration is where you've got a healthy ground layer. So always when I'm sort of driving on a paddock and so on, the owners are keen to plant and so on, I'm actually looking for that ground layer, because if you've got that ground layer, it's already there, that's going to be awesome for seed bank for future. Planting trees, planting eucalypts is a piece of cake. They're quick, they're easy, they don't need much water, but try and reinstating that understory is crucial. And also these sclerophyll forests, versus to pasture weeds, a lot of the exotic grasses they spread by runners. Soteria, Rhodes grass, spread by runners. Sclerophyll species, they don't, or they've got very poor dispersal of runners. So, and also they just grow straight up. So if you've got your planted tree, like in amongst blady grass and kangaroo grass, the grass isn't going to climb and bring down that tree. They just sort of sit around it. So if you've got healthy blady grass and kangaroo grass in your paddocks, you can just plant a tree in there and you don't have to do much maintenance to it at all. Sure, the tree might grow a bit slower with the competition of nutrients, but you don't have to spray around the tree and do all that excessive work. So when I do looking on a paddock and looking where to start connecting your corridors, and also where you've got healthy ground layer, because you can plant those trees in those grassy areas and they sort of look after themselves-ish. So, and the big journey is like just tackling the weeds on our sclerophyll forest won't regenerate the ecosystem function for this. That's where you would probably need to discuss look on the New South Wales burn guidelines, a fire ecologist or Juggler Alliance, and Juggler Alliance has been really active last year. I don't know if anyone's heard of them or had them come out, but they're absolutely incredible, doing a cultural and ecological assessment on your properties and discussing about long-term management on these forests. So it's important to understand that these forests need to be forever managed. Our rainforest, once they get that canopy, they can sort of look after themselves, but these ecosystems, they need to be forever managed. It's also weighing up what lives in these habitats. Our koalas, our threatened fauna, the forest owls and so on, is if we don't manage them, they will suffer too. So it's really important that we try and navigate that way. I don't know the silver bullet.
I'm wondering, is there a pathway to more protective covenant?
BCT has been great.
Small landholder, that wants to do, just it doesn't really, it doesn't gel with BCT to do that. So is there any way, I guess I'm wondering, is there a way to, bring it all together so that smaller property landholders can, work in unison with each other? They're developing a koala corridor together, they're work together. We've been doing that on Rose Road, working, consecutive landholders, and, if there was that pathway to putting an in perpetuity covenant on certain areas, is that something that can be done, do you think?
I don't know for the process of covenants on smaller properties, because they don't look at less than 20 hectares of actual good condition forest, but contacting your Landcare groups, Landcare's been, but I don't know that answer, sorry. It's up, maybe
I might just say from my perspective as from Lismore City Council, it's part of the conversation that we are starting to have within our team and with other stakeholders to say that we need to start looking at a ladder of funding. So I'm giving out small grants, as you know, Lena, and we've got people that have had those successive grants over successive years, and we want to start broadening our conversations in the resource management community and start saying, well, when can we say, as we have with some landowners, okay, BCT, put a bit of pressure on them to say, your turn, so that we can actually have a ladder of funding so that we can actually be looking at that longer term strategic landscape management. I'm not saying we've got the answer, but there is a recognition from all of us small grants practitioners that that's what needs to start happening for us to get landscape management happening.
Yeah. And what's online? What happens to the work?
And look, what you're saying, what you're doing at Rose Road there, why is that only coming from the community when we've got people in state governments constantly being strategic about environmental works and putting that in projects every year? Why are we all as a community having to spend money every year for the environment where, like, what if we managed to do the way we managed law and order and just go to the current funding and gone on with it and supported our local communities? What can we happy about?
I'm glad you couldn't do that.
We might get tired if we didn't like that.
There is a recognition of exactly what you're saying.
I think that's it, so feel free to ask away, or if you're done, we're done.
Thank you.
Cool.